We can do a lot of things with our minds: recalling, memorizing, deciding, contemplating. Things that we can do we call powers or capacities. The power to recall, the power to memorize, and so forth. These are powers of the mind. Like much of the powers we're familiarized with, the powers of the mind also come in degrees. Most of us can make quantitative calculations, but the level of proficiency in it varies. It varies in speed, accurateness, and explicitness. Some are slower, some are faster, some get the equations right, others don't. Some just provide a result, others are able to flesh out the steps. By analogy, we extend this property of a power manifesting itself in degrees to all powers of the mind. One set of powers of our mind, or soul, is the comparative powers. My name is Aurispection, and in this video we're going to talk about the comparative powers. In our contemporary language, influenced by computer science's concepts and terms of art, we would point to the operations of these powers as part of processing. Computers arrange the digitized data by externally provided instructions. Human beings arrange the perceived world by internal laws of mind. This arrangement of informational inputs consists in storage and meaning attribution, that is, in associating them with other stored inputs, words, and classes, sometimes tagging timestamps and or specific emotions to them. Not all of these elements of processing pertain to the comparative powers. However, this half analogy between computers and human beings might help the viewer to bridge over his or her more familiar concepts and terms with the ones to be used here. These peculiar powers are those by which we discover relations between concrete objects, that is, whole objects. By discover, I mean relations between things that cannot be immediately or directly presented to us, but are apprehended by mediate or indirect operations of the mind. That aside, the operations are: the relation of identity found by the identification power, whole and parts by the Mereological power, resemblance by the classification power, space by the spatial power, time by the temporal power, proportion and ratio by the proportional power, active property by the potential power, cause and effect by the causal power. None of these names we use to tag the powers is mandatory. For instance, the classification power could be called the typification power or the categorization power. Important here is to understand that for each relation there's a power or a capacity to find it. Identity manifests itself in two forms, namely, identity proper and difference. By our identification power, then, we discover things that are the same and things that are different, repetition and diversity. It is relevant to add that this power is not put into action separately. In an act of identification, both identity and difference are asserted to be the case. When noticing a certain tree with engravings, we both discover it to be the same now as before in our childhood, but also that it is different from other trees. When noticing a certain book, we both discover it to be different from all others in our collection not now present, but also the identity of many of those collected books. In both operations, we compare presented objects with relevant representations of past presented objects. In the first, we discover the relation of identity by comparing the presented engraved tree with representations of past presentations of the same tree, and we discover the relation of difference by comparing the presented non-engraved trees with representations of past presentations of the engraved tree. In the second, we discover the relation of difference by comparing the presented book in our hands with representations of past presentations of many of the books in our collection. And we discover the relation of identity by comparing representations between themselves of our collected books. That said, all these relations of identity are discoveries, and so we got to them in a mediate or indirect way. All these discoveries concern external objects. But what about ourselves? Another identity we discover is our personal identity. This personal identity should not be confused with the bare or simple knowledge of self as numerically distinct from everything not self. By personal identity, I mean the gradual discovery of traits and tendencies and the events associated with their persistence or change. This is the history of our qualitative changes and how they characterize the same continuous being, us. We gradually discover our real self by comparing past selves with each other and past selves with present self. This implies that difference in the retention powers and comparative powers will make a difference in our narrative and theory of ourselves. If our memories are scarce and our awareness very coarse, the reconstruction or ideographic explanation of ourself would also be very poor. It would be otherwise with greater powers. Another factor to note is attention. Greater powers mean nothing if they are not put to use. In this case, used in the discovery of our personal identity. By discovering what makes our self, we also discover how we differ from other selves, other persons. This at least partially explains, I think, why introspective and differently lived persons differ wildly from other persons surrounding them, who eat, have fun, suffer, read, think, and pursue life goals more or less the same way and in the same things. This is how, here and there, we find interesting individuals with very interesting thoughts about the world and creative artistic productions. In sum, everybody knows to be a something separate from everything else. People notice a self, but specific characteristics of this self is a progressive endeavor of our comparative powers, and so there are people who know themselves better than others, that is, their personal identities. Whole and parts also manifests itself in two forms, namely, whole to parts and parts to whole. The relation of whole to parts is discovered by the mereological power of comprehension. The relation of parts to whole is discovered by the mereological power of abstraction. By comprehension, we find that a concrete thing, a thing as a whole, is full of parts, and how the thing keeps them all together. By abstraction, we focus on the parts individually. We draw them away from the whole and find how they relate to it. These are the more basic powers. Then we have subsidiary higher powers, namely analysis and synthesis. By analysis, we use the cuts made by abstraction and spread over the various parts instead of just taking them individually. By synthesis, we put together whatever was broken into parts to make a whole. The more developed our mereological powers are, the more developed will be our identification power. It seems plausible to affirm that the more qualitative nuance one discovers by exercising one's powers, the better one gets at identifying and distinguishing objects presented. By the conjoined operations of comprehension and abstraction, we not only dismember an object of its ontologically autonomous parts, but also of its ontologically dependent parts. The latter are commonly called in philosophy as properties or attributes. Now, deficient exercises of these powers can also occur, and which result in different levels of intellectual ability from person to person. There are two ways this deficiency might take place: by omission and by commission. The former concerns the failure to spot an object's part. The latter concerns the addition or introduction of parts not present in the object. Both omission and commission deficiencies tend to occur over ontologically dependent parts, that is, properties. But why is this so? Because these parts are not accessible by our senses, but only by refined experience, that is, by various operations of the comparative powers over our stored memories and its products. But what are you talking about? It seems people in general would have no difficulties in abstracting from a concrete helicopter its fuselage, landing skids, blades, and windows. These would be the ontologically autonomous parts. But we can abstract from it more fine-grained parts, such as properties, that which has no reality outside of or independently from the thing it is a part of. For instance, the property of anti-torque system requirementness, to avoid the fuselage to rotate with the main rotor system, or the property of aerodynamicity, to satisfy desired levels of lift and tolerable levels of drag. Both properties have no existence or reality outside their instantiation in the concrete object. Both, when considered as products of the mind, are properly called abstracts. In these more fine-grained abstractions, unphilosophical minds might mistake a helicopter with other rotorcraft machines, such as gyrodynes or gyroplanes. Although these machines share the property of main rotor systemness with helicopters, their forward thrust is also provided by a traditional fixed-wing system with propellers or jet engines. These differences in properties produce very different effects in flight performance, and so they are not simply superficial or cosmetic differences. Less developed mereological powers, then, tend to associate with errors of omission. Then there are philosophical minds with more developed mereological powers. These tend more to errors of commission. Francis Bacon would classify this as a problem of excessive refinement. This is when more sophisticated minds delusively cut properties not really there out of the objects, and then might even proceed to perform abstraction over these invented exogenous properties. This is how reality is mixed together with fiction or completely replaced by it, when reification accompanies the mereological powers' activities. Once these errors take place over abstraction and analysis, nothing stops a very artificial synthesis to come next. From this deficient synthesis arise the greatest philosophical and theological chimeras, which their creators believe to be as real or even more real than their own hands or thinking minds. This is also how sophisticated minds profess the stupidest of things to the world, while looking with contempt or condescension, or even both, at the common folk, never touched by the metaphysical balls of thread their minds continuously entangle. By exercising comparison over objects in our minds, we also find that they resemble in many ways without being the same. By finding these resemblances, we automatically tend to classify them, that is, to group them into a class. After abstraction, we may associate various objects with the property abstracted and group them together. As abstracts, when these classes or groupings are considered as products of the mind, we call them concepts. A concept contracts and expands depending on how much abstracts we put together. When abstracts are used attentively as admission or rejection conditions of our objects, we call them marks. Further, the amount of marks that make up a concept is designated as the concept's intension. The amount of objects admitted by the concept is designated as the concept's extension. These relate in an inverse fashion. The more marks, the less objects. This is a stricter concept. The less marks, the more objects. This is a wider concept. The former has higher intension but lower extension. The latter has lower intention but higher extension. That aside, there's an implication from the mereological powers over resemblification. We know there are errors of omission and commission to be made in the discovery of mereological relations. If this is the case, these errors will affect the concept formation. Errors of omission will contribute to concepts that admit more than the objects from which the mereological operations were applied. For instance, lumping tokens of gyrodynes in a concept of helicopter. This kind of faulty conceptualization is very clear in argumentation. Fallacies of false equivalence, false analogy, or illicit transfer are just a few manifestations of it. But concepts can also get too strict by rejecting the very objects it should contain. These can happen by errors of commission. Adding more abstracts than those formed by properties found in all the target objects will occasion the faulty conceptualization. For instance, rejecting a helicopter with landing wheels by fixing landing skids as a mark of the concept of helicopter. It is a faulty operation because the type of landing gear varies from machine to machine. Landing gear is not an essential property of helicopters. Another way to artificially add marks to a concept is by fabricating properties in the target objects. For instance, rejecting actual gyrodynes in the concept of gyrodyne by positing a property of CTOL, that is, conventional takeoff and landing, as a mark. This leaves the concept of gyrodyne empty and a bunch of machines nowhere to put, since they do not classify as airplanes, even assuming CTOL, because they use a rotor system to provide for thrust in flight, and do not qualify as helicopters because they use some kind of propeller system in their fixed wings. Finally, errors of commission might result in complete artificial concepts. Here, the error is not a simple mistaken mark, but a whole bunch of marks that have no place in reality. That is, their respective properties are not found together anywhere. As an example, take the Spinozist concept of substance. He says in Ethics, written in 1677, "By substance, substantia, I understand that which is in itself and is conceived through itself, that is, that the conception of which does not depend on the conception of another thing, from which conception it must be formed." So, what are the marks of this concept? For any X member of a concept S, X must 1. Exist by itself, that means it doesn't need anything else to exist, and 2. Be conceived through itself, that means it doesn't need other concepts to be conceived. And what exactly falls into this concept? From where were those marks abstracted from? Supposedly from God. But then again, God is a concept himself. This means, although God falls into substance, substance doesn't cover every mark of God. What is God then? Again, by God, Deus, I understand a being absolutely infinite, that is, a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence. For any X member of concept G, X must 1. Be absolutely infinite. That means a substance of infinite attributes, and each attribute expresses eternal and infinite essence. Okay, what about this mark? How did Spinoza come to it? How did he know that God has such properties? Well, he doesn't. This is pure speculation. He further conceptualizes attribute as the way the intellect perceives substance, and eternity as bare existence or non-tensed, devoid of duration, existence. So, in the end, we have substance and God as concepts with the same extension, the thing admitted in the concept. For any X member of concept S and G, X must 1. Exist by itself, 2. Be conceived through itself, 3. Be perceived by the intellect in infinite ways, 4. Be non-tensed, and 5. Be non-limited. Now, first, Spinoza alleged substance to not need any more concepts to be conceived. However, we've seen that it needs another concept, the concept of God. This concept adds to substance points 3 to 5. Why? Because the item that falls into substance is not completely covered by the concept. That means one cannot understand that item only by substance. One needs the concept of God, and the concept of God requires at least the concept of attribute and eternity. Second, besides being internally inconsistent, it is, as was said, externally shady. From where were those marks 1 to 5 abstracted from? What is the datum for them? No answers for these questions. We discover relations of space because many objects are presented to us as in space. This should not be confounded with Kantian theories. I am not affirming there is some notion of space in our minds without which we could not understand the objects before our attention and sensorial organs. I am affirming that space exists outside of our minds, though we know it through concrete objects positioned in it. Objects are presented as in space to our minds, and through careful, attentive application of our comparative powers, we might abstract spatial relations between these objects, or even for those really gifted, abstract space altogether from the objects and consider the pure relations of space, as it is done in the field of geometry. Analogous to space, we discover relations of time because all objects are presented to us as in time. Again, no Kantian theories here. Time is not a mere notion in our minds, but again something independent of us. We also know time through concrete objects, not as they are presented to us, but through our memory and imagination. We cannot use memory without thinking of it as a recalling activity, that is, as bringing to mind what was presented to it before but not now. By memory, we recognize that what we perceived as present is not present anymore but something past. By thinking in this past thing, we conceive the present as after that past thing. This relation of afterness we call future. We then, from the present, transfer this relation from past to present to something after it, not yet before us. What will happen then is always imagination. We can only speculate in a more or less informed way from the past how the relation of afterness is applied to the present. That is, we can only speculate what is on the other side of the relation. We can know, however, following simple relational logic, that the future exists, though we are blind to it. We know to exist precisely because the afterness relation was abstracted from a past moment and the present moment. However, from here we understand that on the past moment, the now present moment was the future. Applying that same relation to the now present moment, we know now there is a future constantly passing through our presentative powers, and so becoming the present moment. Aside from this, we can also completely abstract time from all its objects and think about the pure relations of time as it is done in the field of temporal logic. We know quantity intuitively, It is something noticed, not found or discovered. However, relations between quantities means that proportions are of the latter type. We discover these in the most common human activities, from baking cakes to building rockets. We discover by accumulated experience that quantities of this or that thing have specific interactions. These relations can be found and documented for practical purposes, but as space and time, proportionality can also be completely abstracted from its objects, and the science of pure ratio and proportionality can be erected, as it is in mathematics. We also know intuitively about power in objects, that objects can be or do this or that. However, what objects are and do between themselves is something to be discovered by the exercise of comparative powers. These are modal relations, or ways things can be between themselves. This should not be confused with cause and effect, which will be treated after. As an example, can a human upper body be related with a horse lower body? Well, we can relate those two in our minds by imagination. We call them centaurs. But that relation was never found anywhere presented to us. Some objects relate necessarily, that is, they must or they cannot fail to relate a certain way in all circumstances or contexts. If I divide one orange with one cut, I'll have two pieces of that same orange, and two halves of an orange cannot fail to make one orange. By abstracting the mereological relation of fraction from the orange and its pieces, we find that two halves must make one. Necessary relations are the object of study in every deductive science, mathematics, or logic. But there are also contingent relations, that is, relations that might fail between objects. Contingent relations are those that can be produced in at least one circumstance or context, but not in others. These relations are usually the object of the empirical sciences, namely, to discover in what circumstances or contexts relations between things obtain or not. From modal relations, we now center our attention in cause and effect. From general cans and cannots, we go to a specific type, namely, can X make Y do something else? Very early in our lives, the comparative powers of causality kicks in. Touching the button causes lights and noises. Crying causes parents to concern. This is one of the most important powers in our mental arsenal. For good or bad, it is that instrument by which humanity raised itself from chipping stones to engineering foods at the cellular level. We have a constant desire to make our lives easier. That desire pushes us constantly to understand how the world works, so we can intervene on it. Or, in other words, the more we know of the complex web of causality that surrounds us, the wider our sphere of activity gets. From it, we learn we can get to where we want by doing things or avoiding doing things. This both applies to material and mental or spiritual aspects of the world. Sometimes we discover X to cause Y just by simple experience, that is, just by comparing two recent items in our memory. I compare my previous state before touching the heated pot with my latter state when I touched it. It hurts in a special way we call burn. I conclude from this comparison, at a first glance, that pots at a certain level of heat burn. But at a second glance, after applying abstraction, heat at a certain level, wherever it's instantiated, in a pot, in coal, in water, etc., it will always burn and do damage to my skin. Other times it's a little harder. We have to perform more or less controlled tests or experiments and take mental notes of how the causal candidate items perform, individually or in diverse combinations between themselves. I want to take water from the well without all the work of lowering and pulling buckets. I want something faster and easier. I have to consult memories and find things that cause elevation in other things. I remember that when I applied suction into a drinking straw, the water came upstream into my mouth. I have then to find a way to develop some kind of giant drinking straw to take the water from the well. But I don't want the water to come to my mouth. I want it to fill buckets. I need then a giant straw with some kind of device from where the water flows out. And many other problems would follow from here. Many types of giant drinking straws would have to be built until a satisfactory result was obtained. Maybe a discovery similar to that of Causation, the water pump, would come out of it. And we're done with the comparative powers in this video. We also talked about things presented to us and representations of those things by us. These are at the hands of other mental powers and are going to be treated in future videos. The next video will be about the representative powers or reproductive powers.